You guys mentioned the Obama administration coming in, sort of a new day at EPA. What are sort of a few specific things that the Obama EPA could do that will make this picture look different next year?
I would just offer a couple of things that are happening right now that are very demonstrative of the Obama administration's commitment to the Chesapeake Bay. When the new administrator of EPA, Lisa Jackson, joined, she sent out an all-hands memo to the 17,000 or so EPA employees, and she chose in that page-and-a-half memo to highlight two water bodies, the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake Bay, as areas of her significant interest. Second, I think we're seeing through the Economic Recovery Act a major investment in infrastructure and job creation in this country, but there is also a substantial emphasis on green infrastructure and green development, and we see that as a great opportunity to invest in America's infrastructure, the upgrade of wastewater treatment plants and the like, but also habitat and ecosystem restoration, and perhaps Peyton can talk briefly about NOAA's resources. A third example is the existence of Chuck Fox. He spoke earlier, David, about his being here. He's been designated as senior advisor to the administrator on the Chesapeake and the Anacostia. I think that is a wonderful marriage of a local watershed and a large watershed effort, and demonstrative of the administrator and president's commitment to water resources, and specifically the Chesapeake and Anacostia.
I'd just add to that, over the years, I think one of the things that was produced by the program was a Blue Ribbon Panel report that talked about the financial challenge, the enormity of that challenge. So I think the administration certainly has put forward some significant resources that can help to implement projects that we've heard for many years were underfunded. And specifically, speaking for NOAA, we're making available between $150 and $170 million nationally for shovel-ready restoration projects that will both create jobs but fundamentally invest in green infrastructure, as Jeff referred to. That's real on-the-ground restoration projects that might include any number of habitat restoration projects in Chesapeake Bay, and we certainly know the states are working on drafting those proposals for projects in this region. And the assistance I mentioned earlier with respect to blue crab disaster, $10 million in each state in the omnibus appropriations bill that the president signed. There's an additional $5 million for each Maryland and Virginia. So a significant infusion of dollars, I think, to help address the economic challenges that are faced by watermen. And personally, I believe by providing that ability to focus some of that attention on their economic sustainability, distinguish between that goal for something like oyster restoration and the ecological goal. So if we can separate those two objectives, we can achieve a significant improvement in the way we've been doing some of this work. And for oyster restoration, that means bifurcating the economic sustainability of the industry with the focus on ecological restoration of oyster reefs.
If I could add a very fine point on what I've heard and very much agree with, and I'm not part of the Obama administration, but I think there are some examples of what's happening in the region that the question would be to systematize it across a broader front. Very particularly, in the District of Columbia, we have a permit issued by US EPA, which is to govern the pipes that discharge to the Anacostia, the Rock Creek, and the Potomac from stormwater runoff that does not mix with sewage. It's called MS4. It's separate storm sewer systems. When we negotiated that permit with EPA, the question is, historically, we've always been able to reduce pollutants from pipes. How do you get it? How you manage the land around the pipes? That's what we're all talking about, whether it be a farmland or a home or a commercial property. What we did in the district as part of the permit from the federal government is there now obligations about how we clean our streets, how we pick up litter, how we plant trees, operational, an incentive program for retrofitting existing buildings. Montgomery County was just issued a permit that has retrofit targets and deliverables on retrofitting for stormwater. That's using federal tools to change the manner in which the landscape at the local level is managed. And that, to me, is a direction that the Obama administration should take on and take off with, because we have some ideas already, but systematically doing that across the region would make a huge difference.
EPA has told chicken farmers on the Eastern Shore, speaking of non-point sources, that they have to make some serious changes in the way they operate. Obviously, they're not happy. Can any one of you address that?
Thank you for your question. Several months ago, EPA did promulgate revised regulations that apply to concentrated animal feeding operations. These regulations did a couple of things. One, it clarified the role and responsibility of certain operations to seek federal or state discharge permits, including large chicken operations. They are not unique to the Eastern Shore, but certainly do apply to a fairly large number of poultry operations on the Eastern Shore. We think these regulations will help bolster and ensure accountability that farmers are taking appropriate management actions on their farms to protect nutrient runoff. What happened recently was that the federal rule had a date, the end of February, for these operations to seek coverage under permit. And I think what we saw across the watershed is, frankly, hundreds of chicken farmers providing notice to EPA in the states that they were in fact seeking coverage. And that was a very good sign that farmers understood their obligations.
I just wanted to get specifically to the Bay Barometer. By next year, maybe just give me a timetable of when we can see improvements specifically. You said it might take a little bit longer. We can't see any immediate improvements, but when can we see improvements?
I'll just quickly offer that with respect to the living resources of the bay and the blue crab population, there's a significant evaluation tool that we use each year called the Winter Dredge Survey that gives us essentially an analysis of how the crabs are doing as compared to the previous year. The results of that survey are not yet available for this year, but as soon as they are, I think we'll have an ability to look at the management actions that were taken by the states and determine were they in fact effective. Are we seeing a resurgence of the crab? So with respect to a species like the crab, which can rebound pretty quickly, we could and should see some results pretty quickly on that population if these management actions were effective.
Unfortunately, in the water quality and lower trophic levels in the habitat side, we're still to the point where, like in the underwater grasses, we've seen, you see resurgence, some of that due to a drier spring or something like that, a lot of runoff coming from our city streets or from our neighborhoods or from our farmland areas out there, and you say that's good news. I think the place to really look in terms of underwater grasses is the upper part of the Chesapeake, the Susquehanna Flats and others, where we're about 97% of what we think we need underwater grasses-wise. There was a place that started from almost few sprigs of grasses and have come back and has shown, even under large hurricanes like we saw several years ago, that system has now rebuilt a resilience that we don't see in the Middle Bay and the lower Chesapeake Bay or in our rivers yet as well. So we're going to have to look for grasses. It's not a bay-wide signal in that 77,000. It's more in terms of what's happening in the chop tank. And what about we're seeing a resurgence in the Susquehanna Flats, what's happening in the Potomac. So we're going to look for smaller stories to then build that up. Dissolved oxygen the same kind of way. As I said, our pollution diet is still well above what we need to get that bay metabolism sticking back in there, so that the big bay-wide trends are not going to see much. We are seeing some signs where we are starting to make, at a much smaller scale, when you put blue planes in, there was, and the upgrades that George referred to as well, that river transformed itself over a decade period to something that is now one of the top bass fisheries out there and still has some ways to go. So we've got to look for that story at smaller scales, small river systems. Scott mentioned some rivers as well that are starting to recover out there. Unfortunately, when we put it into a single bay barometer, you see small but little increments. What we've got to do is to look sort of in our backyards, up the streams, and to small parts of the estuary to see those stories. They are occurring out there, but at the bigger picture, they're masked because of the continued population and the fact that we haven't taken all the actions that we know we need to put in place.
A lot of our management actions are actually put up in the watershed, and in the watershed, the majority of our sites are starting to show decreasing levels of nitrogen and sediment. So that's where you would expect to see the first signal. So now we need that signal to be translated down into the bay.